Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham. The subject we're looking at here is Pte AV Studio and particularly creating the third image. If you're watching on YouTube, please consider subscribing to my channel, and if you hit that notification bell then you'll be informed whenever I put up a new video. The third image is a technique that's one of my favorites and I've used it quite a bit. What I like about this technique is that we can create the third image in Photoshop. It's not difficult to combine two images to create a third, a derivative of the other two. Then we present three images in Pte AV Studio with our derivative sitting between the two images that helped us to create it. To create the third image I use Photoshop's layers and layer blending and also layer masks. Now that already sounds more complicated than it really is. Now as I've been talking, you've been seeing one or two examples of this technique. Generally speaking, I found that the technique appears to work better with one bold image and one that contains some texture. Now the textured image could well be used as a way of introducing a title, but it can be used anywhere of course. I have found that two detailed images generally again don't work too well with Photoshop's blend modes, but of course there's always going to be some exceptions to that. So if you're a Photoshop user, let's take a look at how it's done. Now I've brought you into Photoshop here and I've opened up two JPEG images. Both of them have been cropped to 16:9 aspect ratio, but they haven't been resized. There's something like 4,000 pixels each on the long side. There's the first of them, and there's the other that you saw when the screen opened. Here's the texture I was talking about in the introduction. So what we need to do to make a start here is to create a layered stack of these two images. I tend to do that by just dragging the tab from the screen there, and with the Move tool selected from the top of the toolbox we can just click, drag and drop. But here's a little tip. If you hold the Shift key when you do this, then the image you drag and drop will fit four square over the top of the other, and of course that's the position we need it to do the work we need to do next. Now generally speaking, I've found that this often works a little bit better and gives us a bit more freedom when we've got the texture image sitting on top of the more bold image. So I've got that the wrong way round here, but it's easy to remedy. Let's just click the lock to the right of the background and it'll be removed, and I can simply click, drag and drop. Then I need to select my texture layer and we need to go through the blend modes and take a look and see which one takes our liking. Now what we're about to do has become a little easier over the years, because when we go to the blend modes now we don't have to apply each one, we can just mouse over them and we get a preview, so we get a good idea of what's going to work and what isn't. Darken and multiply usually are worth looking at. Generally I find color burn, linear and darker color doesn't. Remember when I say generally, there's always going to be some exceptions, isn't there? Lighten screen, generally I don't use those or any of these, but overlay, there's a nice one, soft light and hard light. Let's go back to darken. What do we like best? Darken, hard light, soft light. We're all going to choose something slightly different, or even maybe overlay. Let's assume at this point I'm going to select darken. Sometimes when we do this we amalgamate the two images, but then we feel that maybe we'd like to just brighten that a little bit before we actually use it in our slideshow. Now to do that, what I would do is to select both of these, hit Ctrl J, and I'll get a duplicate pair of those two images. I can then, while they're still selected, right click and choose to merge just those two, So in effect, if I reset these all back, and I'll set that back to normal, what I've effectively got here is my first image, my amalgamation, and my third image. Then all we need to do is to save all three of these as JPEGs, but I want to do just a little bit of work on this image, maybe just to brighten it up a bit. What I tend to do, and this is personal to me, is I tend to go back into Camera Raw. Even though I'm not using a strictly raw file here, I've got so used to the controls in Camera Raw, and I do like using them. So I can take this image back into Camera Raw. I could tweak my exposure, I could add more clarity, I could add more vibrance. I think you get the idea. If I wanted to shade the image a little bit at the bottom, I could possibly pick up a graduated filter and I could shade the image. When I'm happy, I can click OK. There's the three images set up in just a few moments. Now we need all three of these saved, and we need them saved as JPEGs. So why don't we let Photoshop do that for us? We can go way over to the left hand side and go to File, Export. And down here we're going to find an option that says Save these layers to files. What it's going to do is to allow us to decide where we want them saved to. I'm going to click Browse, and I'm just going to put them into a temporary folder that I'm using for this particular demo, which I've called the third image. There it is there. So that's the folder. We'll click OK to that. The name prefix is not important, but you can see here, look, we can select just the visible layers. Well, we want all three, so that's relevant to us. Yes, we do want JPEGs. I'm not really needing the ICC profile, but we don't usually worry too much about that. But here, look, I can even select the quality. And when I click Run, Photoshop's going to save all three of those for me. There it is, done. Now we could take them into Pte AV Studio and create the effect. As you can see, I've brought you into Pte AV Studio, and these are the three images we just exported in Photoshop. I've added a blank down the bottom, but to make these three images all work together, we just need to put them into the slide list in order. This one first, I'll double click, and double click. Now when we go into the timeline, it's going to vary depending on the music and what we choose to do with the first slide. If the first slide is going to produce a title, we're going to need a bit of space. But if we didn't need too much space, then we don't generally want a lot of distance between the first and second. We may want a little bit more of a lengthy transition, whichever transition we choose, but the best types of transition here are the fade or the wipes, where the smoothing line has been increased. And then of course with just 2 or 3 seconds, again depending on the music and what we're trying to do, then we may fade on to the next one, and we can use different transitions to do this. So if I just put my cursor back at the start there and press play, there's the first image, which as I said could contain a title. Now we get the third image, which in actual fact is sitting in second position. And finally we'll fade on to the bold image. Now the reason this technique is called the third image is because it originated back in the days when we were shooting film and we would create audio visuals with 2 projectors focused on a screen. So we would have the first image come up, then the second image come up, and as they crossed over for a brief moment in time, they often created a third image. And we could stall the fade gently to make the most of that third image. But today we can do it quite easily in Photoshop, Photoshop Elements, or any software that allows you to work in layers. Now quite often I'll work directly from raw smart objects opened up from Adobe Camera Raw. That's what you're looking at here, that little symbol at the bottom right. tells me that this is a smart object. Smart object is just something I can double click. It'll open back up in Adobe Camera Raw and I can make changes. So these are the two images that I want to start the process with. So I've got them to the stage where I want to use them as single images. So I've got to create my third image. Now the technique is exactly the same as what we demonstrated just a few moments ago. What I can do is make a copy of these two, and I'm going to need to do that. So if I right click just alongside the texture image, I can choose to make a smart object via a copy. Now I'm going to do the same with my bold image here, and I'll move that one up to that point there. So there's our first image, there's our third image. We're going to use these two to make that one that's going to sit in the middle of the two, but of course we refer to it as the third image technique. Now let's take a look at those blend modes once again and select something which we think is going to be suitable. So let's go down to darken, multiply, that one doesn't look too bad, color burn, not too good. You can see what I mean, they're not working too well there. Lighten screen I'm not happy with. I'm going to jump down to overlay. Overlay looks quite nice. Soft light looks good. Hard light looks good. But maybe a little bit too much of the texture is coming through. So let's backtrack. Soft light. Overlay. I think overlay is my favourite. But let's just assume for a moment that we wanted to choose multiply because we liked the effect. Our image now is quite dark, but because we've got smart objects here, I could double click this thumbnail and it'll be opened up directly into Adobe Camera Raw. Let's do that and we can lighten it just a bit and see the effect. So once the image is opened up into Camera Raw, I can make as many changes as I wish. I could affect the color, clarity, texture, anything I wish. And when I open it, if it doesn't work, I can try something else. Here we're looking to lighten the images, so I'm going to raise the exposure and click OK because it's going to have an impact on the other one, and I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to live with that, but you get the idea of how we can use smart objects and raw files to create the images that we wish to use in our slideshow. Now, one of the issues we need to be aware of is how a derivative image containing texture may affect faces. It's not too bad here, but the lady on the extreme right and the guy at the top is being a little bit obliterated by the texture. It can distort faces to the point where they look rather odd, but it's so easy to fix with a mask. Alongside my texture image here, down at the bottom of the layers, I'm going to add a layer mask. Over on the left hand side in the toolbox, I'm going to select black as my foreground color. A basic, simple, soft edge brush. 100% opacity and 5 or 10% flow. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit on the image, not quite as much as that. Let's try that again. Something like that. Adjust the size of my brush and I can just paint over this guy's face, maybe to take that ugly line across his face away. And we could do the same with this lady here. We could just take some of that line away, just remove some of that filtering, just to make her face a little bit nicer to view, and of course the young lady over here. As you can see, it's very quick, very easy to do. Once we've finished this, of course, and we're happy, save it as a Photoshop file just in case you do change your mind and you want to come back a bit later. But there does come a stage where we need to select both of these, right click and choose merge layers. Then we need to save all three layers in exactly the same way as we did before. Let's give that a go. When we went to File, Export, Layers to Files, we're going into the right place now. It's remembered where we was working. The prefix of these is called history. JPEG is the same as before. Level 8 is good. Let's create them. Once we're back into Pte AV Studio, I'm going to select these three images. I'm going to select the texture image first, but of course this isn't actually cast in stone that we always work from the texture first. We can do it the other way round if there's a need. But there's my derivative image, which is my third image, but strangely enough it's going to be the second in this group of three, and there's the last one. Now, one thing you may notice is these images are falling short of the aspect ratio of the slideshow I'm making, because I opened these up as 3:2 aspect ratio images, and now I'm trying to put them into a 16:9 aspect ratio show. Well, I can probably make a change to make the images fit, but of course I've got to make sure that all three images are adjusted in exactly the same way, because they are all relying on one another, going from 1 to 2 to 3. Let's start that process with this final image of the three by opening that up in the Objects and Animations screen. Now, the most easy and obvious way to do something like this is to go up to the zoom controls and just zoom the image until it fills the screen. But we've got a bit of a problem here, because we've got a guy here who's now going to lose part of his head. So maybe I can change tack and use a different way to zoom the image in. So I'm going to double click that X, and I'm going to sever this little chain link by giving it a click. Because what I'm going to do to start with is to click on the zoom X, scroll to the right so I'm making a bit more of a panoramic shape. I think that looks okay. I don't want to go too far and distort the people too much. Then I'm going to lock the link again and go back. So now I'm going to zoom the whole thing just a little bit in its entirety. Now you can see I'm going to just move that up a bit to, let's make that 120. We can see now that we've got 120 and 107.143. What we could do here, just to make it a little bit easy, is to just sever that link again. Just make that 107, because that's an easy figure to remember. So all we've got to do is skip back to the previous image and apply 120 and 107. So we can do that up here. Let's skip back, sever that, 120 and 107. We know all three of these images now are going to match nicely. And all we would need to do in conjunction with the music that we're using is to adjust the transitions and the fade lengths. So as you can see by the turning round of the screen, I brought you into the timeline exactly the same as before. We would adjust exactly where we want the first slide. We would adjust the fade onto the screen to the length we desire, and then we will place this one in a relative position, and probably will need to be guided by the music, but basically if I put my cursor at the start, we can have a look at that in the mini player just above. And once again we could incorporate our title with this, but that's not essential. That fade looks a little bit long to me. I would have to adjust that, but again it does depend on the music. Audio-visual enthusiasts have to walk a fine line between the actions we take to enhance our presentation and those we take that don't. Just because something is clever and novel doesn't mean it's going to add anything at all to our presentation. The third image generally does add something, in my opinion, of course. This video can be downloaded from my website along with many other technique videos for Pictures to XE8, Pictures to XE9, and now Pte AV Studio 10. There are many Photoshop videos on my website too, and of course on YouTube. If you are viewing on YouTube, remember to use those playlists, because they're going to allow you to find tutorial video sets much easier. And I always present my videos in sets and in the order we recommend viewing. Now, some years ago I made a slideshow that uses these techniques, and it's called Nature's Textures. I'll link below to that MP4 presentation. Thanks for watching. See you next time.